In the village of Rybatsky, located on the Neva River a little north of Leningrad, the first stop was made. The propellers had already been removed from the Gremieshi and pontoons had been placed under the hull. All this was done to reduce the ship's draft. 11 tugs harnessed in the cables fixed on the bow of the destroyer and dragged it upstream. Up to Schlisselburg passed relatively calmly. But Ladoga met us unfriendly. The wind was blowing across the huge lake. Waves pounced on the helpless ship. The pontoons hit the side, leaving deep dents in the hull. The men forgot to rest. They had to continuously supply the pontoons with compressed air, tighten heavy steel cables. The sailors worked in the penetrating wind for 24 hours. But now the Ladoga Lake was passed. The ship was pulled into the Svir River. At its mouth they had to stop. The river was so shallow that the pontoons could not help. The sailors puzzled for a long time, and still found a way out. A large barge was brought to a deep place, and thousands of tons of stone and chains were loaded into it until it sank. Then a ship was brought here, and all the cargo was unloaded from the barge, and the water was pumped out. When the barge surfaced, the ship was inside it, like a floating dock. All this titanic work was done manually by sailors and Ipranovians. The draught of the barge was small, but the river was so shallow that this floating dock could not pass through it. The assistant to the commander of the ship, Senior Lieutenant Andreev, suggested to raise the barge on wooden pontoons. The bilge machinists, commodores, electricians turned into carpenters. Under the direction of Lieutenant Korotkevich, they chipped large wooden crates, flooded them, and put them under the brackets embedded in the sides of the barge. Then the water was pumped out of the boxes. The dock's draft was now further reduced. Tugboats pulled it along the Svir. However, at the approach to Sigevets Rapid, the pontoons began to cling to the ground. How to overcome Sigevets, the most dangerous rapid on the Svir? Again, sailors' wit came to the rescue. A daring decision was made to block the riverbed and thus raise its level. They found some old barges and put them across the stream. The barges were manually loaded with stone until they sat on the ground. We worked waist deep in water. It was already October, the water was cold. People did not stop at anything. Communists and Komsomol members set an example. The commissar of the ship, senior political officer Novikov, and political officer of electromechanical combat unit Rozhkov went to the most difficult areas. Their selflessness fascinated sailors. Late in the evening, our ship acquired a new passport. Before that, the letters GSH, which meant Gremishchi, were painted on its board in whitewash. They were ordered to be painted over and replaced by the numbers 01. The bosun wanted to entrust this work to one of the guilty sailors, but senior political officer Rozhkov was indignant. Is it possible to turn an honorable job into a punishment? The commissar was right. Petty officer of the second article Mikhail Tursky, the commander of the first gun of the main caliber, was assigned to write the shipboard number. His crew had distinguished themselves at the artillery inspection firing in May. The giant Tursky is busy with his brush on the quay. Despite his tallness, he can hardly reach the tops of huge figures. The petty officer works with enthusiasm. He makes a stroke and steps away from the board to look from afar, like an artist in front of an easel. Tursky slouches by habit. His exorbitant height causes him a lot of trouble. In the wardroom, the petty officer has to bend his head to avoid hitting the mains and electric bulbs. Still, he broke a lot of glass lamps with his forehead. A lot of trouble, a bump on the head. And you have to answer for the broken hood. I'm watching Tursky from the deck and I'm a little jealous. If I hadn't been on watch, I might have been given the job. But the ship's messenger watch on a Saturday night is boring. A lot of people have gone ashore. I don't get any orders, so I just stand on deck doing nothing. On the shore, illuminated by the dim night sun, it doesn't set in our lands in these months. The town of Polani is spread out. Its amphitheatre encircles the quiet bay. Behind it, majestic granite cliffs stand like sentries. It was my duty to greet those returning from leave. The first one up the gangway was the Commodore Sasha Sivolob, black-haired, snub-nosed, with a weathered face. He smiled sympathetically at me, with his plump lips. Watchkeeping on a day off is no fun. The Commodore told me that he had seen the play Pericola staged by Moscow artists at the Fleet House of Culture. It was great. He admires. I just sigh. Day duty prevented me from going to the operetta. Now wait for a chance. It's not often that we North Sea residents are spoiled with attention from the capital's artists. Sasha Sivalov is shining with happiness. And not only Pericola is the reason for that, he is still experiencing the joy of success. Sivalov is the dispenser on the second cannon. Possessing Bogatyrsky strength, this sailor playfully handles heavy shells. At the last artillery firing he distinguished himself and received a commendation. Now, no one will dare to make fun of Sivalov for the blunder he made when he was still a young sailor. The Gremishi was approaching the wharf. The boatswain gave the command cranes overboard. Sivalov, not wisely, grabbed the nearest crane and threw it into the water, instead of hanging it at the side. Sasha was much surprised at the boatswain's scolding and promise of punishment for instantly carrying out the order. From that day the sailors, referring to Sivalov, said that's the one who threw the crane overboard. What a mark for words our sailors are. Take, for example, anti-aircraft gunner Alexander Svekrov, who had just returned from the shore. The nickname Gypsy stuck to him, though he had the white head of a northerner, a slightly pink face with a thin nose. But Svekrov danced Gypsy so temperamentally at our amateur art concerts, and in addition sang tabor songs wonderfully under the accompaniment of guitar, that now he is not called other than Gypsy. Then the commander of the 4th Cannon Nikolai Afonin and signalman Nikolai Fokiv came on deck. If the first Nikolai was called Tula Baker by his friends, alluding to his civilian specialty, the second was called Spare Binoculars for his incredible eyesight. At the duty officer's cabin, the two Nikolaevs were caught up by Mikhail Selivanov, a dexterous in his movements, with a brave demeanour, a rosy-cheeked foreman of rangefinders. This is the reader declamator. He is a great master of telling breathtaking life stories, sometimes of dubious authenticity. Shortly before 24 o'clock, midshipman Ignat Grigorievich Yakovshenko, the foreman of the engine crew, came to the ship. Apparently the midshipman seemed bored in the empty apartment after the departure of his wife and child to the south. Yakovshenko is a wonderful man. A hard worker, modest, smart. In a word, a communist. And as always, the last to arrive on the destroyer was the boiler machinist Semyon Komenko. Quick, with a mop of red hair on his head, on his freckled face he had a devious grin. Komenko is always in a great mood and has a vicious appetite, especially at breakfast time. When friends ask Semyon where he gets such an appetite for food in the morning, he answers with the most unperturbed look, "Why are you surprised?" After all, I haven't eaten all night. We do not know where Semyon disappears on shore, but he always comes panting and at the most critical moment, when the hands of the ship's clock converge on the number O. If he had stumbled a bit on the run, we would have written him down as late, for which we don't pat our heads. Soon Petty Officer Tursky was walking along the closet, having finished the work assigned to him. With the words "Now there's order in the Northern Fleet," he carried a bucket of paint and a brush to the half bay, to the paint room. It was not possible to talk to Turovsky. I was called by Senior Lieutenant Alexander Mikhailovich Vasiliev, the ship commander's assistant. He asked me to bring him a log of the duty officer's remarks in his cabin. Alexander Mikhailovich is an attractive man. We, sailors, love him for justice, for respectful attitude to our hard work. If you do wrong, he will punish you, reprimand you. If you do a good job, he will not forget to praise you, thank you, and after the whole day you will be a birthday boy. The assistant commander loves young people, can take us around the ship for hours, familiarize us with its structure, better than the bosun to teach us the tricks of the sea practice. His intimate conversations are remembered for life. Cheerful, witty, he sometimes makes us laugh to the cramps in the stomach. I remember once I was on the messenger watch, and Vasiliev was on duty on the ship, when the guests, soldiers and officers of the frontier part came to Gremieshchi. It happened that one major sat on the bollard and smoked. Alexander Mikhailovich squinted at him for a long time, not knowing how to tell the senior officer that it was not allowed. Finally he called me over and ordered me to sit on the bollard in a whisper. I, perplexed, complied with the order. And then Vasiliev came up to me and began to cut for violation of maritime culture. Without letting me open my mouth, he scolded so loudly and angrily that I was seriously frightened. The guest looked and looked at us and rose from the bollard. At midnight I beat off the bottles. The ringing of our bugle was intertwined with the ringing of the other ship's bells, rolling over the silent roadstead. The watchmen of destroyers, submarines, and gunboats were celebrating the new day. I was called from a nearby destroyer loud. I looked there and saw Andrei Polishchuk, a boy from Uman City, at the cut of the half-bank. He was smiling in all his white-toothed mouth. Andrei and I studied in the same shift at the Kronstadt Weapons School and became friends there. Oh, congratulate me. He stuck out his narrow chest. I've already received a commendation for keeping watch. You, I say, can be congratulated, but your anti-aircraft gunners. Polishchuk was silent. He was an anti-aircraft gunner too. And he had nothing to say. The thing is that all this week the turn to carry the readiness for air defence of the main base of the fleet fell to the share of Gromkoy. And it turned out that when a Nazi scout flew over Polyarny, the destroyer's anti-aircraft gunners were confused and were too late to open fire on the intruder. Why didn't you fire? Our anti-aircraft gunners, led by Petty Officer 2nd Article Svekrov. There were no instructions, justified the artilleryman of Gromkogo. We were afraid of getting something wrong. Petty Officer Svekrov kept them busy all day long. And in the evening of the same day another airplane with crosses on its wings flew over the raid. And again Loud was late in opening fire. The first to fire was the coastal anti-aircraft battery. After that, Svekov stopped talking to his colleagues from Gromky. 2 days ago I heard a conversation on the bridge. The commander of our destroyer division, Captain 2nd Rank Vitaly Alexeyevich Fokin, nervous, was talking about the fact that fascist aerial scouts were also appearing over other points on the Kola Peninsula. What would that mean? I thought. After all, there is a non-aggression treaty between the Soviet Union and Germany. You can expect any nasty thing from the fascists, said the captain of the 2nd Rank at that time. They are not ceremonious with treaties. And the day of June 22nd promised to be rare in the north, sunny, warm, windless. A lot of interesting things were expected. The commander of the division proposed to hold a ship relay race for a prize. The projectionist brought 2 new movies from the shore. Our library received a lot of books. For the sake of Sunday, radio operators exchanged gramophone records with comrades from the destroyer Stremetelny. The commander of the artillery combat unit, Olymp Ivanovich Rudakov, threatened to come with his wife to teach sailors to dance on the dock. The navigator Senior Lieutenant Ivashenko announced a lecture in which he would analyze the actions of the Russian Black Sea Fleet at the capture of the Turkish fortress Sinop. And why did I have to be on watch on such a day? I would be deprived of all pleasures until the evening. My thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ringing of the bells of a loud battle. Must it be the training at the posts again? I thought. Oh, that's superiors, even with a day off, do not count. The gangways and decks of the Gremeni rattled under the feet of the sailors running to the battle stations. The battle alarm on the Gremieshi was played by Captain 2nd Rank V. A. Fokin. He was still at the aft superstructure when the commander of the ship, Captain 3rd Rank Gurin, hurriedly approached him. The commander of the division reported the password, by which the Northern Fleet introduced heightened operational readiness. Anton Iosifovich Gurin pulled up more than usual and looked at the anti-aircraft bridge. There everything was ready to open fire. Gun crews were in place, ammunition was fed, people were closely watching the air. To the shore ran sailor announcers. Soon on the harbour wall showed commanders and super-enlisted men who were resting at home. They were hurrying to the ships. Above the pipes, Gremishi and Loud shuddered heated air destroyers raised vapour. Announced that several Nazi destroyers approached Soviet territorial waters. We were ordered to intercept the uninvited guests. At the 3rd hour of the night, Gremishchi and Gromky left the mirror-quiet Ekaterininsky harbour. In the Kola Bay, we were joined by 3 more destroyers, Stremetelny, Kubyshev and Uritsky. The latter 2 are veterans of the Soviet Navy. Uritsky is the former Zabiaka, which in October 1917, together with the cruiser Aurora, entered the Neva to support the rebellious St. Petersburg proletariat. Our new ships have to proportion their course with the capabilities of the old destroyers. The sea is calm, warm. Over the water is a light haze. We've been sailing for a long time. Signalman Petty Officer Second Article Fokiv reported that he sees on the horizon the tops of the ship's masts. However, the rangefinders did not notice anything in that direction. This time Nikolai Fokiv was obviously mistaken. Amazing. This has never happened to him before. The guy must be overly worried. Seagulls saw us off from Polyarny, but then they began to lag behind. Finally, only one of them was left above the Gremeni. It circled and circled over the ship, and then silently sat down on the mast rail. Pointing at it with his hand, the commander smiled. Look, Anton Iosifovich, according to the old Poma belief, it is good. The omen did not come true. The return to Polyarny was overshadowed by the news that at about 4 o'clock in the morning fascist planes bombed the city, and as if echoing our mood, the weather turned bad. Black clouds swollen with moisture crawled in from the west. From them, as from a giant sieve, the fine rain poured down. A cold wind came up. We had to put on overcoats. In Polyarny, we took down from the ship everything unnecessary in the battle training loading machine, training devices, unloaded training shells and torpedoes, taking instead of them combat ones. At 14 o'clock on the radio transmitted a government message about the treacherous attack of Nazi Germany on the Soviet Union. The thunderstorm, the approach of which we felt, broke out. Among the sailors there was only one conversation about the war. Commissar Alexander Ivanovich Rozhkov appeared on the Ute. He told us about the formidable danger looming over the motherland, called for vigilance, discipline, expressed confidence that each of us would fulfill our duty to the end. So, the night of the summer solstice has passed. The gloomy first day of the war came, dissolving all the charm of the quiet white night. I take notes and look out the porthole. Overboard the water rings, rough from the rain fountains. War. It has snaked its way to our sacred frontiers. How will we survive? The grey hull of the Gremeni is sunk into the mirror like surface of the Kola Bay. All around is night silence. Even the screaming seagulls have quieted down. The sun, having passed over the North Pole, rolled to the east. The western slopes of the green hills are sinking more and more into shadow. Tell me, what a change. Sailor Goria stretched out, lowering his binoculars. Yesterday it was raining, and today it's fine. Gorin, black-haired, with a face covered with swarthy skin, is an excellent anti-aircraft gunner. He speaks slowly, as if listening to his voice. Petty Officer Svekov looked at him. Good weather, keep your eyes open. Got it. Gorin raised the binoculars to his eyes again. We had just returned from Motovsky Bay, where we had convoyed 2 transports with infantry. During the crossing the weather was overcast. From the swollen clouds that clung to the tops of the masts of the Gremishi, the rain poured on the sea, on the decks of the ships. Our destroyer followed a constant course, parallel to the movement of transports. It was the commander's mistake, for which he was reproached by Captain Second Rank V.A. Fokin. A. Gorin did not justify himself. He now realized that if an enemy submarine got on the way, it could take advantage of our carelessness. We were saved by poor visibility. The clumsy cargo ships, looking like irons, were constantly hidden behind streaks of rain charge. While they were pulling into the bay, the burden covered them from the seaside. We stood at battle stations and watched around us with a keen eye. On the way back, some of the sailors were disappointed. It's a majesty, not a war. What do you want? A fascist caravan. Svekov got angry. As always, our commissar came to the cabin just in time. We surrounded the senior political officer in a tight ring. Everyone was concerned about how our northern fleet started the fighting. I am not the fleet commander, smiled Rozhkov. I do not know everything. I only know that destroyers Kubyshev and Uritsky successfully launched an artillery strike on enemy troops. Order. The sailors murmured approvingly. Seeing Svekrov, the commissar called him to him. Gather all the anti-aircraft gunners on the bridge. We have a conversation. When all the anti-aircraft commanders positioned themselves at the guns, Alexander Ivanovich told them. Our fellow destroyers Kuibyshev and Uritsky at first sloppy. They were in a hurry. The result was nonsense. It turned out that the anti-aircraft gunners in the turmoil opened fire at our airplane. Apparently they did not understand the silhouettes of their own and enemy vehicles well enough, and when fascist planes appeared, the anti-aircraft gunners were confused. If we had such a chance, we would not fail, assured Petty Officer Svekov. Do all your sailors know how to recognize enemy planes? All of them. Like their own 5 fingers. We won't confuse them. Look. Remember the saying, don't brag when you go to sea, brag when you come back. The senior political officer left. The petty officer pulled off the sailcloth shirt which had come loose from under the straps of his gas mask and brought the binoculars to his eyes again. He looked to the west. From there a black cloud crept ominously eastward, dishevelled like an old broom. If only we could spot those vermin in time, muttered Svekov. All these days I often watch Alexander Svekrov. Going up to the bridge, I see his weathered to painful redness face open, expressing all the thoughts of the petty officer. Svekov is simple and direct, like his life. He studied at school, then worked at a woodworking enterprise in Petrozavodsk. From there he joined the Komsomol and went to the Navy to the Gremieshi. Father-in-law is kind and docile, as long as everything is in order in the department. If any of the anti-aircraft gunners poorly perform their duties, a thunderstorm will follow. In such cases the petty officer is merciless. In the direction of Polyani heard clapping. Svekov pointed his binoculars there and saw in the sky curly caps of anti-aircraft shells bursting. He also saw several black dots moving toward Vayenga. Airplanes. The ship was shaken by the bells of a loud battle. The sailors rushed to their battle stations, but there was no commotion. On the port side ran those who had been painted at the stern posts. On the starboard side the men rushed to the half bay. This is prescribed by the ship's rules on alarm to run in such a way that the sea always remained on the right. Meeting streams, traffic jams are excluded. Soon everything was quiet. The mouths of anti-aircraft guns of our destroyer stared to the west. Barrels, barely moving, moved on the course of enemy aircraft. The Nazis were still far away, but the unaccustomed hum of their engines already reached our ears. Are they going to Murmansk or to the airfield? Guesses Svekov. No, this way. Battery, shouted Commander Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Stasenko. His dry, thin face blazing blush from under the steel helmet knocked out a strand of blonde hair. Enemy planes are moving forward, although around them all the sky in the flakes of ruptures. Fire. Our anti-aircraft guns rumbled deafeningly. Below, in the galley, something rang and rolled across the deck. Rattling shrouded in clouds of smoke, through which glistened flames. Chute and other ships. In front of the enemy planes stands a wall of explosions, but ominous black birds stubbornly fly forward. Stasenko, overlapping the rumble, calls the number of another curtain. He guesses that Hitler's self-confident pilots, accustomed to easy victories in Western Europe, will not turn off course. And so they did. Shells burst heaps, but the bombers all go. Suddenly Stasenko opens his eyes wide, happy. I am closest to the senior lieutenant, at the mouth of the intercom pipe connecting the bridge with the control post of artillery anti-aircraft fire. I follow the officer's gaze and see something that makes my heart race. One Nazi bomber bumped into the fire screen, put by anti-aircraft gunners Gremeny, sluggishly pecked the engines, straightened up again, but after a second or two fell aside and fell on its nose. It was falling with a long tail of smoke. It's burning, damn it, shouted the senior lieutenant. The formation of airplanes broke. Another bomber caught fire and, descending, pulled toward the hills. The commanders were concentrating at the guns. Passionate about their work, the sailors did not look back when explosions rumbled in the direction of the village of Belokamenka. This fascist pilots, having lost hope to break through to the target, were dropping bombs in the bay and on the coastal rocks to escape from the danger zone. To anti-aircraft gunners rose the commander of the ship, Captain 3rd Rank A.I. Gurin. "Thank you all, comrades, for the first success." He shook our hot and sweaty hands. "You have opened the combat account of the Gremieszki. The first test of fire crew of our destroyer withstood. We are still at anchor, reflecting enemy air raids on Wajęga and the airfield. Life is quite calm, and the sailors are beginning to grumble everyone wants to fight, but in such a battle that the fascists are sick of it. We envy our comrades who left us for the Marines. One day we approached Lieutenant Gavrilov with the intention to find out from him when to go to sea. The most cheerful of us, Petty Officer Selivanov, asked, 'Comrade Lieutenant, may I ask you a question?' Boris Vladimirovich Gavrilov is the commander of the Artillery Fire Control Group. In addition, he also performs the duties of fire control manager of the Magpies on air alert." Hearing Selivanov's voice, the lieutenant broke away from the night viewfinder, with the help of which he watched the movement of ships on the roadstead. "Ask him, Comrade Petty Officer." The lieutenant was hot, but his neat blue tunic with a white and red bandage on the sleeve is buttoned up. The lieutenant wiped his neck and early greying head with a handkerchief. "I don't understand something," Comrade Lieutenant Selivanov said hastily. "Why are they keeping us on the roadstead? Do they not trust us, or do they keep us safe?" 3 questions instead of 1. "You're a cunning man, Selivanov." The lieutenant was silent for a moment. He could have limited himself to a stereotypical phrase the command they say knows better. For us it would have been the most offensive. But Lieutenant Gavrilov is not like that. He realizes that not for the sake of a good word asks the petty officer. Besides, I heard yesterday, as Gavrilov himself talked about the same thing with the commander of the ship. We knew that the lieutenant was troubled at heart. His relatives remained in the place, near which the fighting was already going on. Many of us had the same state of mind as Boris. The enemy was trampling Ukraine and Belarus, the native lands of many sailors of our crew. Gavrilov should have understood us. We loved him very much and trusted him. He came to the Gremieszki in 1940. At that time Selivanov was already an experienced petty officer. They immediately found a common language. The young officer quickly entered the rhythm of shipboard life and won the sailors' love. Sailors are an inquisitive people. They found out all the details of our lieutenant's biography. They found out that he came to the Navy on a Komsomol ticket and was sent to the Sevastopol Naval School. There he became interested in artillery. He passed the final state exams perfectly. He, as an excellent student, according to the old tradition, was given the right to choose service in any navy. Friends advised him to stay on the warm Black Sea. But Gavrilov chose the youngest and the most difficult by climatic conditions Northern Fleet. Sailors know how to appreciate such deeds. "So what did you want, Selivanov?" The lieutenant interrupted the silence. "It's a shame. Von Kuibyshev and Uritsky have already shelled the coast occupied by the enemy. And we're still standing. We'll be rusted to the anchor barrel. Don't talk about grain without cracking the nut. They're just doing without us for now. Rest assured, when the rattlesnake is needed, we'll be called." We were called the very next day. True, not to the sea, but deep into the Kola Bay, towards Murmansk. The fascist aviation increased the frequency of raids on the city, bombed wharves, fish factory, residential areas. From behind the massive granite shoulder of Abram turned out a pack of aerial predators. The bombers, humming their engines, split into 2 groups. One headed for the city, the other for the port. Fokiv determined. Dornier bombers. Coming at us. Petty Officer Selivanov, standing on the bridge, raised a hand-held rangefinder to his eyes. In a few seconds he already gave the distance to the Nazi planes. The deep blue sky was mottled with patches of clouds. Sliding under them, the enemy bombers were coming in on the floating workshop where the Gremieszki was moored. At the left side gun were Lieutenant Gavrilov, Petty Officer Tursky gunner, adjuster and ammunition carrier. The fire manager through binoculars followed the lead plane. The bomber went along the bay, huge with black crosses on the fuselage and planes. Fire. Gavrilov waved his hand. Tursky pulled the trigger. The gun rumbled and immediately fired again. Gavrilov looked back. The speed of the gun was unusual, but there was nothing to be surprised about. At the gun stood the giant Tursky. He worked deftly, clearly with his left hand snatched from the carrier shell, pushed it into the breech and closed the lock, and his right hand pulled the handle. Gavrilov's ears were ringing from the frequent shots. Without hearing his own voice, the lieutenant gave commands to the gunners. Skittish fireflies of shells flew closer and closer to the bomber. Flashed, came to the lieutenant. He saw it himself. The Nazi airplane caught fire, lurching, began to turn around. But it did not leave the battle. It descended and came straight at us. Hit him in the forehead, shouted Gavrilov. It is difficult to say what shell hit the Dornier again. The bomber trembled, went off course, and it saved Grimsby. Dropped by the Nazi 500-kilogram bomb, flew near the very tip of the forecast and crashed into the bottom silt, bare tide, 2 to 3 dozen meters from the side of the destroyer, standing on the drying motorbot Sable before our eyes lifted up and broke in half. A dense and heavy sound hit our ears. A black pillar rose at the sight of the explosion. Tons of dirt rained down on the gun platform and the wing of the running bridge. Selivanov and Fokiv managed to take cover under the canopy of the main command post. Artillerymen could not do this, and they were covered with a stream of mud knocked off their feet, scattered to the sides. Tursky found himself at the base of the chimney. Lieutenant Gavrilov, falling, badly bruised his face. But he quickly got up, spitting and wiping his eyes, all dirty, black, and commanded. Squad to the gun. Fire. His commanding voice immediately brought the stunned anti-aircraft gunners to their senses. Feet slipped on the silt-covered deck, but the sailors quickly took their places. However, it was no longer necessary to continue firing. The raid of enemy aircraft was repulsed. Only now Gavrilov saw how Dirty Wave carried away from the board of his cap Black Sea cut, which he was very dear. His clothes were all wet. After the unexpected mud bath, the lieutenant was freezing to the bone. But he couldn't go to change his clothes, there was no air alert. And here came a cold wind, and Boris Vladimirovich became completely unbearable. Commodore Kirillov stepped up to him and silently threw his huge coat on the shivering commander. "Thank you." When the air alarm was sounded, the lieutenant, seeing Selivanov, a rangefinder, who had come down from the bridge, called him over and pointed to the remains of the Dornier we had shot down. "You were longing for the real business. As you see, it has begun for us." After that, on the burden, more and more often there was an exclamation not written down in any instructions. "Make way for anti-aircraft gunners." One day the sound of bells of a loud battle raised us from our bunks early in the morning. Rare curly clouds floated slowly and majestically across the sky, barely driven by the wind, which was tired during the night. The high blue sky was clear. The enemy planes did not show themselves. This time our crew received a new combat mission. Soon Grimsby took off from the barrel and rushed into the open sea. Behind our ship, swaying in his keelwater stream, went Destroyer Loud. "Where and why are we going?" The commissar gave us the answer. It turned out that a fascist submarine torpedoed in the sea our ship Maria Yulianova, which was going from Murmansk to Arkhangelsk. As a result of the explosion, the stern broke off and sank, but the ship remained afloat. Our task was to protect the damaged ship from new attacks of the enemy and tow it to the nearest port. The pale sun was shining. Grimsby and Loud were going at full speed. A 4-point wave made the ships make deep bows to the Barents Sea. Cascades of spray were flying from the sides, hissing. The wind whistled in the tackle. The destroyer's foremast vibrated and seemed to bend. We on the Grimsby was not indifferent sailors. Even those who were on watch at the bottom found time to lift the lift and lit, and, leaning out of the hatch, to ask the first mate on the upper deck, "How's the situation?" "So far, everything is normal." Having heard such an answer, The curious sailor closed the hatch cover in his own way and went down to his post. Signalman Fokiv was the first to notice the ships on the horizon. When we came closer, we saw that the dark hulk of the mother ship had settled heavily into the water. The old three-tube destroyer Uritsky tried unsuccessfully to move the damaged vessel. The destroyer Kuibyshev was rushing around them, searching for the submarine. He changed tack, occasionally stopped the course, as if listening to the thickness of the water, and again rushed forward. But the fascist boat disappeared. Anton Iosifovich Gurin, pressed against the sailcloth cover of the bridge, watched the efforts of the Uritsky. In a brown raglan, in a cap with a strap around his chin, the commander paid no attention to the penetrating wind. Alexander Mikhailovich, how would you solve the problem? He asked his assistant senior Lieutenant Vasiliev. Stocky Vasiliev, squinting his eyes from the wind, looked at the sea, at the sky, thought. Gurin waited patiently. We, sailors, have long noticed this habit of our commander not to miss the opportunity to consult with his subordinates, to make them think creatively about the solution of the problem. If the answer was not satisfactory, Captain Third Rank did not wrinkle his nose, did not chuckle, but immediately calmly analysed the error and patiently led his subordinate to the correct solution. Finally, Vasiliev, with his usual thoroughness, spoke. With a torn off the stern of the transport was deprived of the move and control. Therefore, I find the actions of the commander of the destroyer Uritsky correct, although somewhat premature. He should have pursued the submarine before our arrival. In my opinion, it makes sense for us to take the submarine in tow. The other ships need to increase the diameter of the guard ring. Their job is to keep enemy aircraft away from the damaged vessel. The planes will definitely come here as soon as they get the message from the submarine. Right. Approved the commander. Rattling and loud approached the ship in distress. Gurin, who took charge of the rescue of the ship, ordered all ships to take places in the combat guard. Signalman Fokiv barely had time to transmit this order by flag semaphore, as it was heard. Airplanes. Dots of enemy bombers were growing, approaching, then disappearing behind the fluffy clouds, then appearing in the windows between them. Overlapping the howling of the boiler fans, the bridge heard the sing-song command of Senior Lieutenant Stasenko. Bar ta ria. The barrels of the anti-aircraft guns of the Gremeny turned toward the approaching enemy. Petty Officer Svekrov brought his binoculars to his eyes more often than usual. Commanders froze at the guns, waiting for the command. And now a chain of cotton balls grew in the way of the bombers. All the ships of the convoy fired. Automatic guns sounded, large caliber machine guns chattered. 2 bombers turned aside, the rest still jumped through the curtain of fire. Foamy columns grew at the side of the ship. Hitler's pilots dropped bombs by some means. Our anti-aircraft gunners did not let them aim. In the evening, when the sun was slanting to the west, 12 more Junkers came. Divided into groups, they simultaneously attacked all the ships of the convoy. 3 bombers rushed to Gremyashchi. Only by skillful maneuvering our commander saved the ship. The bombs fell a few meters from the sides. Explosive wave tore off one of the racks with depth bombs. In the hull of the destroyer formed numerous dents from shrapnel. 2.5 hours later, a new raid. Deafening palmbas stood over the sea. 3 bombers again attacked our ship, the rest were rushing to the base. The bomb exploded very close to us. Commissar Rozhkov, who was on the bridge, was knocked down by the blast wave. We rushed to him, but he shouted, "Stand down. Mind your own business," and got up without our help. Fortunately, the commissar was only slightly bruised. This time the enemy didn't leave with impunity. Stasenko's anti-aircraft gunners hit 1 plane. Junker's stone fell into the Sea Kabletov 60 from our board. At that time, in the southern part of the horizon, we recognized several moving dashes. It was the patrol ship Groza and several Mobo boats coming to support the convoy. Now, the anti-aircraft power of our detachment increased even more. A new wave of bombers came out of the clouds. 5 planes came in on the floating base, the rest attacked the ships, diverting the firepower of the convoy. Every now and then Gurin threw commands to helmsman Igor Pishilin. A petty officer of the second article with an imperturbable cheekbone face unmistakably translated the handles of the steering manipulator. Rattling surrounded by high water columns, rolled to the right and left, increased or decreased the stroke. The bombs burst deafeningly, sometimes shaking the entire hull of the ship. The destroyer trembled from the incessant firing. We lost count of the air raids. The guns did not have time to cool down, and again had to open fire. Everyone waited for dusk. Autumn was coming in the polar region. The nights became darker. We hoped that the darkness would help us. In the sky cleared of clouds blinked idle stars. Gurin made a decision. We will take the base until the arrival of the rescue ship Memory of Ruslan on a tow. At the stern of our destroyer sailors bosuns Kavunev, Pilivanian, Tarabarin unravelled towing cable in a hand thick. They were helped by the commanders of the fourth gun of Petty Officer Afonin. The steel rope was bending unruly, rattling on the deck planking. Despite the fresh weather, the sailors threw off their coats. Senior Lieutenant Vasiliev was in charge of the work. Rattling stern cautiously approached the bow of the mothership. Kavunev, throw. The throwing end flew on the deck of the ship. Soon the crew of the mothership pulled the rope from the Gremishi to themselves. The secured tugboat stretched with a string. The floating base obediently moved from the place and went in the keel-jet destroyer. And suddenly explosions rumbled. The sailors on the ute ducked from surprise. Behind the stern of the Gremeni blindingly flared flame. With a murmur, the water blown up by the explosion fell down. Only now we all heard the howling of the fleeing bomber's engines. "Shoot, damn it!" rushed Vasiliev to the aft machine gun. The firing began again. Vasiliev, still angry and dishevelled, jumped up to the stern cut. Looking at the water, he realized that the ships had been given away by a phosphorescent storm. The senior lieutenant raised his head and listened. In the distance was heard the rumble of aircraft engines. There was a new wave of enemy bombers. This raid was the most brutal. Airstrikes were subjected only to warships. The Germans realized that, without dealing with them, they will not be able to destroy the ship. The destroyers maneuvered in a continuous surge of falling bombs. From the hull of the Gremeni sometimes flew rivets. The planes were gone, but the aft machine guns still fired into the sky. "What's the matter?" asked Gurin. It turned out that the gunners, deafened by the almost incessant firing at the planes, mistook the stars for the exhausts of aircraft engines. Anton Iosifovich recommended anti-aircraft gunners not to be nervous and calmly observe the air and sea. The rescue ship Pamiat Ruslan approached our detachment. Gremishi chose his tug and joined the guard. He changed several tack while the ship was taken in tow, and again the fascist planes came. Then the unbelievable happened. The captain of the rescue ship arbitrarily gave up the tugboat and headed out of the danger zone at full speed. We, on the Gremishi, which was fighting off the dive bombers, did not pay attention to it at once. When Gurin noticed what had happened, he shouted to the signalman. "Fokiv, pass the order to the rescue ship, fulfill your task." A thin ray of a hand signal lamp flashed. A minute later, Fokiv read the response from the rescue ship, "I have no right to risk the ship." Gurin gasped with indignation. It was the first and last time I saw him like that, but he quickly coped with the outburst of anger and calmly ordered the officer of the watch. Full speed. Set course for Ruslan. Seeing the rapidly approaching destroyer, the captain of the ship came to his senses and turned to the mother ship. At dawn, the ship, even more tilted on the left side, was towed to Tereberka. On the passage, the group of ships was subjected to 2 more ineffective raids of fascist aviation. The destroyers Gremishi and Gromki headed for the Kola Bay. Passing by the lane that connects the harbour of Poliani with this bay, we noticed a searchlight on the tower of the signal post. Fokiv, to our great delight, read, "I thank you for the successful fulfillment of a difficult combat mission. Conflot." Captain 3rd Rank Gurin looked at the clock face and noted, "Our ship spent 14 hours and 16 minutes in combat with the enemy aircraft. This time we really passed a difficult test." Anton Iosifovich smiled miserably. His black eyes were surprisingly sharp and tenacious. Everyone who met him remembered the sharp, slightly squinted look. It seemed that he looked at the interlocutor evaluatively, as if asking, "What are you, brother, worth in the real business?" Such was our commander of the steering squadron, petty officer of the second article Igor Pishelin. He was of medium height, thin, and for solidity he grew a small moustache. This moustache became a subject of jokes among the sailors. Once on the eve of the destroyer at sea, Igor looked at the bay in our peculiar ship's club. Here at any time of day or night you could learn the latest, and sometimes incredible news. Taking his time to smoke his short pipe, Pishelin stood at the spire and listened to the conversation of the sailors, which revolved around the upcoming campaign. Naturally, we were all interested in the weather forecast. "Here comes Igor," exclaimed artilleryman Afonin. "He can tell better than any barometer." Afonin and Pishelin were firm friends. The artilleryman had long been convinced that his friend was well versed in meteorology. He had learned it on the Volga, where he had sailed as a helmsman of a tugboat. Pishelin took his pipe out of his mouth, puffed the fragrant smoke, and answered briefly. "Storm, snow charges. We must dress warmer." The message of the chief helmsman did not frighten anyone. "A storm is a storm, we got used to it long ago." That's why the sailors changed the subject at once. Someone began to tell a funny story about the first days of his service. Bursts of laughter often interrupted the narrator. The story was obviously exaggerated, but we had an inviolable rule: if you don't like it, don't listen, but don't interfere. Suddenly Afonin, looking slyly at Pishelin, asked, "Igor, why don't you shave off your moustache? After all, they age you by 10 years. I made a vow. Up to 2 airplanes shot down by you. For every vulture, 1 moustache." There was laughter in the wardroom. "Well then, comrade petty officer, sharpen your razor," exclaimed Gorin. "Your moustache will be unfortunate." Pishelin calmly listened to the gunner of the anti-aircraft gun, took his time to knock out the tube in the water cut-off, and only then measured his interlocutor with a mocking look. "Don't boast, Commodore." The helmsman twirled his short moustache. "You shoot down the airplane first, and then get to my moustache." It became even more cheerful on the deck. Pishelin has been serving on the Gremishi for 3 years. Everyone respects him. A great master of his craft. Once we were caught in a hurricane. For 6 hours the water swells rattled the ship. Waves slammed into the bridge. On the signalman and helmsman wet clothes froze, turned into an icy shell. Rattling, guided by a skillful hand, steadily moved forward. And no waves and wind could not throw him off the set course when at the helm stood Pilin. Once the commander of the ship called Rozhkov. "Commissar, look astern, at our trail." Behind the rumbling on the bumps of grey-green waves stretched smooth, as if drawn on a ruler, frothy track, the ship moved as if on a string. Excellent work. Igor Pishelin had never received a different assessment. And not only him, but also his subordinates, grey-eyed and brave Ivan Sergeyev, swarthy, stocky Vladimir Gonchar, and others. It is not in vain they say what a petty officer is, so are the sailors. ... Yes. And this time Igor Pishelin was not mistaken. As soon as the Gremishi left the Kola Bay for the Kilda Channel, it fell into the arms of the storm. Wind, rumble of the sea, splashes, rocking, creaking of bulkheads, smell of salt and seaweed, a familiar environment. But the bad weather did not save us from a raid of Nazi bombers. 9 junkers appeared from the shore. They're already over Gremishchi. Signalman Fokiv shouted the first dropped Gurin, immediately ordered Pishelin. Left rudder. The commands followed one after another. Igor Pishelin immediately fulfilled them. The destroyer turned left, right. Anti-aircraft gunners at this time worked at the red-hot guns. Before our eyes smoked one of the junkers. On its plane ran vigorous red flame. The plane turned to the shore, but not passing 200 meters, exploded in the air. Having repulsed the attack, Gremishi laid down on the previous course. Igor Pishelin was still standing at the dock, hunched over, clutching the handles of the steering manipulator. After 5 days in the open sea, Gremishi returned to Murmansk. Sailors began to prepare for their departure to the city. They cleaned and ironed their clothes, washed and shaved thoroughly. Nikolai Afonin, having quickly finished with these things, got into the hatch of the first deck, where the helmsman, signalmen and radio operators lived. Pshilin stood at the mirror and shaved. Afonin watched his every movement. And when the helmsman was about to lay down his razor, the artilleryman stopped him. "Wait, have you forgotten the agreement? For one downed airplane, shave your right moustache now." "Yes," sighed Pshilin, "we had such an agreement." The helmsman took a pair of scissors, and before we knew it, he had cut off his moustache to the very stub. Wait, Igor." Afonin rushed to Pshilin. "Why both?" "So I'm an advance payment," Igor calmly replied. "Our anti-aircraft gunners, I hope they will not let me down, will shoot down another Junkers." We were not able to get to leave then. An air raid was announced. We rushed to take our places. One of the Junkers broke through to the burden. The bomb, dropped by him, did us no harm. Anti-aircraft gunners continued to shoot after the fleeing Nazi. Especially tried to calculate anti-aircraft gun Viktor Slepov, but the glowing points of tracer shells lagged behind the plane. Slepov introduced correction, but the matter did not change. Sailor Dmitriev, the distance and course setter, failed. Having heard the command, he did not immediately find the right division on the drum scale. While he was looking for it, the time was lost, and the line again went far from the plane. Slepov gasped with rage. "Because of you all." He attacked Dmitriev. Not knowing how to justify himself, the sailor said. "Well, I hesitated for a second. So you are ready to do anything to me for it?" "1 second. Do you know what a second means in battle?" Slepov calmed down a little bit. Looked at the sailors. "Comrades, perhaps someone else is thinking like Dmitriev. Let's talk seriously about seconds." From the bridge I could hear Petty Officer Slepov's muffled voice. I listened to him as attentively as I listened to the sailors. Admittedly, I hadn't thought about it before. A shell in a second flies hundreds of meters. Junkers during this time passes 125 meters. To hit it, you must take into account fractions of a second, otherwise the shells will fly past the target. The sailors were silent. Everyone understood it is necessary to learn more to be able to act instantly. Without it, you can't achieve victory. The war made us learn. In this we were convinced at every step. We learned from our own experience how important it is to take into account every detail in battle. There was a case when we were attacked by 14 enemy bombers at once. Signalman Nikolai Fokiev did not have time to report. Right dive. Left dropped. The third one is coming in. But immediately the petty officer corrected himself. Don't pay attention to the third, he's already bombed out. That was the petty officer's discovery. The fascists, in order to mislead us, imitated attacks and those planes that had already dropped bombs. The calculation was simple in the turmoil of the battle. No one will see which plane is dangerous, and which is not. Enemy cunning did not hide from the sharp eyes of a Russian boy Nikolai Fokiev. He watched every plane and helped anti-aircraft gunners to concentrate all the fire of guns and machine guns on those machines that carried the bomb load. This helped the commander to get the ship out of harm's way. Such a thoughtful, observant was our Nikolai Fokiev. Commanding a department of signalers, he taught his subordinates what he himself possessed. He taught them persistently, tirelessly. I remember we were exposed to a cruel storm for 2 days. The bridge, which was accessible to all winds, was pelted with icy splashes. But Fokiev, having changed his watch, did not go to the warm and noisy cabin, but stood leaning with his back to the mast. The watch was kept by a young signalman Rulev, and the petty officer could not leave him. A floating mine was detected on the course. The officer of the watch ordered to inform all ships about the danger. Rulev began to call for a ship following the Gremishi. Fokiev, looking at him, furrowed his thick ashy eyebrows. Get to the right, he advised the sailor. Otherwise the superstructure obscures you and the addressee will not see your flags. The petty officer also noticed that the young signalman, taking the semaphore, did not read it aloud. He wanted to correct the sailor at once, but decided that a visual lesson would work better. At that time Veniamin, who had replaced the helmsman, came up to the bridge. "Stand next to me," offered the foreman to the young sailor. "See how your comrade works." Soon flags flashed on the neighbouring ship. Onukov, like all experienced signallers, read the report at once, and was heard by the commander and the officer of the watch. "That's the way to do it," explained Fokiv. "Then the commander of the ship will familiarize himself with the contents of the semaphore without waiting for the end of the message. While you take it, he will be able to start maneuvering. And in battle, the speed of decision sometimes means everything." The helmsman had a serious flaw: he couldn't stand the rocking. On the bridge he stands all green, barely able to stand on his feet. He's of little use. Fokiv now and then has to help him. But the petty officer does not let the sailor go. On the contrary, even more demanding to him, shouts at him more often than usual. The foreman knows hard work is the best cure for seasickness. "Well, why is your searchlight beam dancing like a drunk?" Fokiv is indignant. "Keep yourself in control." Or, "Again you missed a word. Is it possible to take semaphore like that?" Rulev listened to the petty officer's remarks with a doomed look, pulled himself up for a minute, but then everything fell out of his hands again. Fokiv stood 2 storm watches together with him. Only after that both of them went down to the cabin to rest. When it was time to go on watch again, Rulev got up from the wheelhouse with difficulty. Fokiv quickly dressed and asked him, "Are you by any chance not ill? I'll stand in for you." No, Rulev hurried up. "I'll manage now." After such a school, Rulev became an excellent signalman. And when he received a commendation, he saw 3 floating mines on the way of Gremeni in time, the sailor said. Thank you to Petty Officer Fokiv for science. By the way, it was not easy to detect the mines. And here the sailor's ingenuity helped. Right on the ship's course, Rulev noticed seagulls sitting on something, not floating. And he determined what it meant by his gut, rather than by his eyes. Sounded the alarm. Mina. Rangefinder Gritsai was on watch next to helmsman. He touched his comrade by the elbow. Are you by any chance not delirious? I can't see anything. No, the signalman was not mistaken. When the ship at slow speed approached the seagulls, they rose into the air, and something black flashed where they had been sitting. The convex top of the mine was barely sticking out of the water. After this incident, Petty Officer Fokiv, having given up his watch, did not linger a minute on the bridge. He now relied on Sailor Rulev as on himself. A dense band of rain seized the Gremieshi. At first large drops thundered on the deck, spreading to the size of a nickel. Then thin and frequent streams rushed down. The gunner Alexander Domrin hastily put a cover on the gun, without tying the straps, so that it could be pulled off at any moment. It rained long and tediously. The drenched commanders were talking sluggishly. It would have rained all through the war, said a young sailor, an ammunition carrier. The weather would have been non-flying, and we would have had less trouble with the fascist aviation. You drop it. Domrin turned to him. The more we shoot down all sorts of junkers, messers and other flying trash, the faster our victory will come. And you'd rather sit in peace when the whole nation is at war. That's not what I mean, the sailor took offence. We go to sea in any weather. The conversation dried up with the rain. The sky began to clear, so we had to wait for guests. They appeared when we were already approaching Murmansk. On the mast of the Rambling, the flag of Firmly was flying a rectangle with black and yellow squares. Air. Enemy airplanes in the air is what such a flag means in the Navy. The commander of the calculation, Yakov Petrov, ordered to prepare for battle. The cover came off the gun, the lock closed with a dry clatter after the shell, which was fired by a skillful hand. The small gun in the mighty hands of Domrin pointed its barrel in the direction of the approaching enemy bombers. Target caught. Domrin reported. Petty Officer Petrov raised his hand. opened his mouth to command fire, but the commanders heard a completely different command. Stand down. Everyone was dumbfounded. Why don't we fire? Domrin was indignant. Everyone is firing. Indeed, the other guns were already firing. Command yeoman. Domrin was nervous, but he gave an unusually stern order. Shot. Zero the gun. Grumbling resentfully, the gunner twisted the handle, lowering the barrel. As soon as he had done so, the petty officer ran up to the muzzle and ripped the steel cap off. Domrin's eyes darkened. If the foreman hadn't noticed the irregularity, the barrel would have burst. The gun opened fire. Already after the reflection of the air raid, Petrov asked, "Who put the cork?" The question was asked to the whole calculation. Artillerymen were silent. Finally, a young sailor answered, "I wanted to save the barrel from water. It was raining." I saw the blood rush to the petty officer's face. In his heart he scolded the newcomer with the last words, but said aloud, "You should be more attentive." Everyone realized this applies to everyone. In the first months of the war, many machinists grieved their profession was too peaceful. Some of them even submitted reports with a request to be transferred to artillerymen. It seemed a shame others were fighting, beating the enemy, and you worked downstairs and only listened to the gunfire. Not at once the machinists, especially the young ones, had a change of consciousness, the conviction that all specialties on the ship are equally combat and necessary. And in the fact that on the Gremieści, with respect and even envy began to look at the machinists, a great merit of midshipman Ignat Grigorievich Yakovchenko. This skinny sailor is never seen idle. In a tunic, soaked with oil and sweat, he worked for hours in the hot engine room. His subordinates were amazed at his calmness. It happened. The whole ship shakes from the close explosions, the cork falls from the submarine, and on the face of the midshipman, even a muscle does not tremble. No matter what happens, the ship needs a move, and the midshipman's eyes are fixed on the instruments. The light bulb flashes, the arrows of the machine telegraphs jump to a new division. Full ahead. Bearing watch at the maneuvering valves, Sailor Melnikov turns a huge copper helm. The noise of the turbines is increasing. A new explosion shakes the hull of the ship. In a tightly sealed compartment heat, asbestos insulation of turbines and steam lines is blazing. The sailors' overalls are blackened with sweat. And the hands of machine telegraphs all rushing across the dials. The ship maneuvers, dodging enemy bombs. Finally, the hands freeze in one position. Up above, the firing stops. The fight is over. The phone rings on Yakovchenko's desk. "Tell the machinists my gratitude," hears the midshipman's voice of the commander of the ship. "And you, Ignat Grigorievich, I thank you especially for bringing up such sailors." The midshipman looks at his subordinates. Always smiling Vasily Markin, troublesome sturdy Pavel Sharkov, black-eyed and fidgety, like a teenager Elia Karputkin, slender, handsome Innokenty Prilovsky, funny and witty Lev Pilitsky, stubby, nimble Nikolai Akimov, restless George Nehaychik, all different. And they all have one thing in common. Hard workers, that's what our crewmen called the machinists, putting in this word respect and admiration. Friendly and tireless people. Yakovchenko informs his subordinates about the commander's gratitude. Sweaty, tired faces brighten. The hatch opened and one of the anti-aircraft gunners rolled down the gangway. Seeing the midshipman, he falls out in one breath. "Ignat Grigorievich, it was me who shot down a fascist airplane today. I ask you to give me a recommendation." "Hey, Boo. That is my word of honor. I won't let you down." "I know you, Grigory Zaitsev. You're a good sailor. You'll be my godson." On Gremieshi, few communists had the right to give recommendations for joining the party. Therefore, there was nothing special in the fact that the machine gunner made such a request to the chief machinist. The crew of the destroyer, long ago rafted, has been in many altercations, in which human souls are exposed to their full depth. People well recognized each other. Ensign immediately began to write a recommendation to the machine gunner distinguished in battle. Communist Yakovchenko enjoys great authority on the ship. This is an much experienced sailor. He joined the Navy in 1933. He served in the Baltic, on the old Russian line ship Gangut, which for services to the Soviet people was renamed and carried on board the Sacred Word's October Revolution. He stayed on superannuation, graduated from the School of Chief Petty Officers of Machine Groups. He was left as an instructor in this school. But the heart of a sailor could not stand the service on the shore. He began to ask for a ship again. He got an appointment on the destroyer Gremyashi, which at that time had just passed the factory sea trials. Midshipman Yakovchenko came from the Baltic to the Northern Fleet on the destroyer Gremyashi. It happened a year and a half before the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. The midshipman has a lot of sailors under his command. Each required a special approach. Communist Yakovchenko turned out to be an excellent educator. A young machinist came to our ship, cocky, self-confident. He thought that there was nothing special in the work of turbine operators, and that a good watch will cost itself. The midshipman put him on watch at the propeller shaft bearings. This work is quiet, but requires great attention. The midshipman explained to the newcomer what to do, asked, "Is everything clear?" "It's as easy as a turnip," was the answer. The midshipman kept silent, but more often than usual visited the corridor of the propeller shafts. Suddenly he noticed that one of the bearings was slightly warm. "What's wrong with it?" asked the midshipman. The sailor with aplomb began to explain the possible reasons for the heating of the bearing and the measures to be taken. "In words, you are a professor." The midshipman groped the newcomer with a prickly look, but in practice a bum. "Why haven't you checked the lubrication? For negligent watchkeeping, I'm giving you 2 shifts out of turn. From now on, you won't treat serious business like it's no big deal." The lesson went well. The sailor began to keep watch faithfully. We knew that Ignat Grigorievich had suffered a great grief. Shortly before the beginning of the war, he had sent his wife and child from Polani to Ukraine, to her father. Now they remained behind the front line. Maybe his relatives are no longer alive. But outwardly the midshipman did not give away his worries. He only lost even more weight and became more silent than before. The sailors avoided expressing their sympathy and condolences to Ignat Grigorievich. A strong heart does not need it. The midshipman did not spare himself, was ready to work day and night. His energy was inexhaustible. For us, he was a living example of loyalty to military duty. That's why all our crew rejoiced when they learned about awarding Yakovchenko with the Order of Red Star. The sailors' congratulations had no end. I looked more and more closely at my comrades, simple workers and peasant guys who came to the ship from all corners of our homeland. They never intended to fight. But the thunderstorm broke over the motherland, and each of them became a brave, fearless warrior, as if he had spent his whole life under fire. People change before their eyes. Boiler machinist Semyon Komenko was the most reckless man on the ship. A braggart, a lover of drink on occasion, he spoiled a lot of blood for his commanders. Sometimes at Komsomol meetings he got so bad that, as our witters said, the fluff flew in all directions. But Semyon was like water off a goose. And few people knew that bravado, cockiness, this is only the outer shell of Komenko. In fact, he was a warm-hearted man, always ready to come to the aid of a comrade. In order to help a young sailor, he would stand idle at the hot boilers for 2 or even 3 shifts without a shift, though no one asked him to do so. I also knew that Komenko was a passionate book lover, the most well-read man, and dreamed of a feat. That's why he hated his specialty of stoker. He considered himself offended by fate, a loser. Listening to the stories of anti-aircraft gunners about the battle, he silently chewed a cigar and sighed heavily. People are lucky. So Komenko remained a mystery to his comrades, but there was an incident when his attitude to him changed at once. Rumbling at full speed was rushing into the ocean to meet the convoy, which we had to guard. Suddenly the ship's speed decreased. On the bridge appeared upset mechanical engineer Mark Samuilovich Rotenfeld. He reported about the trouble in one of the boiler's burst water tube. The boiler had to stop. "What are we going to do?" asked Durin. "We will try to eliminate the malfunction." Someone will have to climb into the hot boiler. Who will go? Bo, Red Fleet Komenko. Komenko? The commander of the ship and thought for a minute. He knew every single person on the destroyer, and especially this poor guy. You volunteered? No, I appointed him. You did the wrong thing. What was I supposed to do? When I called for volunteers to go into the sewer, everyone volunteered, and everyone demanded that he be the one sent. A smile flashed across Rothenfeld's tired face. What were you happy about? Asked Görin. I remembered how the sailors first to me, and then to each other began to prove their merits to the Gremishchi. And why? Who, they say, has more merits, he has earned the right to climb into the collector. What devils! Exclaimed the commander in admiration. I thought, continued the senior mechanic, and decided to send Komenko. He is small in stature, it will be easier for him. And there was no other reason. Glanced at the chief mechanic commander. In general, I approve of your choice. Let's test this man on the real case. There was an unusual silence in the boiler room. Turbofans stopped, nozzles stopped their squealing. It smelled of oil, steam and soot. Chief Petty Officer Grigory Bedran examined from all sides a man dressed in a clumsy asbestos suit. The man wore an Ushanka hat on his head, felt boots on his feet, and thick mittens on his hands. The face smeared with Vaseline glistened. It was Semyon Komenko. He was impatiently waiting for the sailors to unscrew the nuts of the collector cover. But now the cover was removed. From the black mouth breathed such heat that the usually slow Bedran bounced aside with a ball. Putting on asbestos gloves, he carefully stuck a thermometer into the vent. When he took it out, the chief petty officer whistled over 100 degrees. Bedran carefully bandaged Komenko's cheeks, nose and forehead with gauze, and put protective glasses over his eyes. The sailor, holding a portable lamp in one hand and a hammer and a long metal plug in the other, squatted down and looked into the black gut of the collector. He hesitated for a moment, then climbed into the terrible hole. The minute seemed an eternity. The sailors were worried about their comrade and kept their eyes on the neck of the collector, from which hot steam was still streaming. No one said a word, but here in the silence there were muffled blows. Komenko had found the burst tube and was hammering the plug. Hardly had the heels of his boots emerged from the neck as his comrades grabbed Semyon by the legs and literally pulled him out of the pipe. Steam was coming off him, and he seemed transparent. Done. Exhaled Komenko. Rothenfeld stepped to the sailor, tore the gauze from his face. I always believed in you, Komenko. The sailors rushed to free Komenko from the asbestos suit. Senka, you're a strong-willed man. I'd like to take a puff, Semyon begged pitifully. The cover of the collector was put back in place. The yellow flame began to blaze again in the boiler furnace. Now the Gremishchi could again develop full speed. Since then, the boiler driver Semyon Komenko was replaced. He settled down, became serious. And he loved his work. He was no longer jealous of commodores, signalmen, and helmsmen. We were afraid that the guy would not become conceited. After that incident he became one of the most popular people on the Gremishchi. He was also published in the fleet newspaper. But the opposite happened. Fame made him modest. He simply realized honor and respect in the war are won not by recklessness, but by courage and work. Finally, the sapper and diving work was over. But then it became clear the power of the available 4 tugs is not enough to carry the bulky dock through the Sigovskaya Narrow, where the current was very strong. Assistant Commander Andreev again found a way out. Sailors began to wend cables on the shore, fasten them to tree trunks, and then manually with the ship's spire to pick out these cables, pulling the destroyer forward. Every few tens of meters of the way, all this operation was repeated. At the approach to the White Sea-Baltic Canal, sailors sank the dock, took the ship out of it. Everything went normally from there. The last lock of the canal was crossed without any accidents. In the port of Soroka, a team of workers of the ship repair plant was waiting for us. With their help, sailors put the propellers, installed the mast, guns and torpedo apparatuses, which followed the ship on a special barge. 3 days later, Gremishi was already on its own way to the White Sea. Here it got into a storm. But the most terrible rocking began in the Barents Sea. Huge ocean waves pounced on the ship, rolled over the deck. Here it was, the north, where we were now destined to carry out our service. In the morning of November 8th, in the watch log, there was an entry: we moored at the berth in Polyani, depth 40 meters. Tense combat training began. Sailors understood that it was not for nothing that the ships were transferred to the north. The White Finns, encouraged by Hitlerites, were openly preparing for an attack on the USSR. Soon hostilities began. The Northern Fleet provided security of the flank of our troops from the sea. The ships were in full combat readiness. Together with other destroyers, Gremieshchi carried watch and reconnaissance service on the distant approaches to our bases, escorted Soviet ships traveling between Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The war with the White Finns ended with the victory of our arms. People breathed a sigh of relief, rejoicing at the peace that had come. But it did not last long. In June 1941, a deadly threat loomed over the motherland. Mechanized hordes of German fascist troops treacherously attacked our country. The Soviet people stood up to defend their native land. The Great Patriotic War began. The Communist Party mobilized all the forces of the people to repel the enemy. The front of the fierce struggle stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. We in the north had a polar summer. The sun did not go below the horizon almost all day and night. The enemy took advantage of this. Having a huge advantage in aviation, Hitlerites made continuous air raids on Murmansk and other our bases. Murmansk was burning. Thousands of people were left homeless, but continued to work for the front. Worked railroad junction, factories, port. Artillery, ships and aviation of the Northern Fleet selflessly repelled enemy air raids. Sailors helped Murmansk inhabitants to extinguish fires, to restore destroyed enterprises. Gremieshchi was under repair when fascist planes dropped bombs on a nearby torpedo warehouse. Fortunately, the torpedoes were without compressed air. This prevented an explosion. But the room caught fire. The fire was spreading. It was already approaching the ammunition stacks. The commander of the Gremeni led his subordinates to rescue shells and torpedoes. People were working among the flames, their clothes were catching fire. The shells were so hot that they burned their hands. At any moment one could expect disaster. But the sailors realized the importance of their work. If they did not protect the ammunition from the fire, the warehouses will blow up, the explosion will kill the ships at the piers. The crew of the Gremeni emerged victorious from the battle with the fire. The ammunition was loaded on the transport, which was taken to a safe place. Day and night, sailors of Gremieshchi kept their combat watch. They fought with enemy aircraft, convoyed caravans of ships, supported our troops fighting in coastal areas with artillery fire, searched for and destroyed enemy submarines, laid mines in the paths of fascist ships. It is difficult for me to write about those days. I did not serve on the Gremieshchi at that time, although all its combat activities took place before my eyes. I was at that time the assistant commander of the destroyer Sokrushitelny. Gremieshchi and our ship together passed from the Baltic to the north, were neighbours at the berth in Polyani, together went on convoy and raid operations. Then I had to part with the north. For 8 whole months I was sent to study on courses. I returned to the fleet in December 1942. I was called by Fleet Commander Admiral A.G. Golovko and announced the order. I was appointed commander of the destroyer Gremieshchi. This both pleased and stunned me. I, a young commander, entrusted to the best ship of the fleet, which by that time its combat deeds had already won a wide fame. Many things confused me. I knew the commander of Gremieshchi. Anton Iosifovich Gurin as an educated, enterprising officer, a wonderful educator. The whole crew loved him. Tireless, energetic, he was able to build a strong fighting team, where everyone was a brave and skillful warrior. Would I be able to replace such a man? But there was no time for doubts. The fleet command trusts me, so I must do my best to justify this trust. The admiral encouraged me and wished me success. And here I am at the pier, where stands Gremishi, just returned from a combat operation. I didn't immediately recognize it. The fancy camouflage had transformed the look of the ship. I go up to the upper deck. The destroyer had just docked after a long and arduous voyage, and it was shining clean. The first person I met was the assistant commander of the ship, Senior Lieutenant A.M. Vasiliev. My comrades told me a lot about him. He is a knowledgeable and loving officer. My luck that I will have such an assistant. I saw the chief bosun, Midshipman Rechkin. With Pavel Andreevich we are old acquaintances, since the time when I was a cadet of the naval school. During shipboard practice he was our first teacher and mentor. Now fate has brought us together again. However, the situation has changed somewhat. Now Pavel Andreevich is my subordinate, but it will not affect the old friendship. The next morning after the raising of the flag, the former commander of Gremieshi, and now appointed commander of our destroyer division, Captain 2nd Rank A.I. Gurin, introduced me to the sailors of the crew, built on a large gathering. In front of me stood sturdy sailors with courageous tanned faces, blown by the northern winds. They were men who had faced death more than once, men who had emerged victorious from the toughest battles. Having introduced me to the crew, Gurin informed about his new assignment, thanked the sailors for excellent service, wished them new combat successes. I briefly told about myself, about my service. I hoped that my new combat friends would help me to get up to speed faster. Accompanied by the assistant commander and the bosun, I went around all the battle stations and once again made sure that the ship was in exemplary order. In the evening we sat for a long time in the cabin of the deputy commander for political affairs. He introduced me to the people of the ship, communists and Komsomol members. Before leaving the political officer, I asked him to show me the historical log of the ship. Until late at night in my cabin I read the scanty lines of this document. They told of the crew's military deeds. They could be envied by any ship of our fleet. At the beginning of the war, Gremishi supported our troops near western Litsa with its fire, destroyed several artillery and mortar batteries of the enemy. Great respect on the ship enjoyed the sailors of the correction posts, who sneaked to the front line and by radio directed the salvos of Gremishi firing from Ureguba. The destroyer placed hundreds of mines in enemy waters. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners shot down several enemy planes. On the account of burden, 1 sunk and 2 damaged submarines. More than 1,000 transports are, and Allied delivered their cargoes to the northern ports under the protection of Gremieshchi. Behind the meagre figures hid a truly heroic labour of sailors. In the historical journal cited the names of dozens of soldiers who for their exploits were honoured with government awards. Some of them were awarded twice. Among these comrades were the ship's mechanical engineer Rotenfeld, the battery commander Moskalets, the commander of the signallers section, petty officer of the 2nd Article Fotiv, the artilleryman's Partorg, petty officer of the 1st Article Phil, and others. With such people there can be no impossible tasks. And I felt even more strongly the responsibility that fell on me, the new commander of Gremieshchi. And in the morning we were already at sea. Our ships in those days did not stagnate in the bases. That day we endured a heavy battle with enemy torpedo carriers. Steering the ship, I saw with my own eyes in the high skill of the crew. Commands were executed instantly. In dangerous moments sailors acted bravely and proactively. After the battle there was a meeting of the party bureau. It considered applications for admission to the party Komsomol members Domrin, Fokiv and Teslenko. All three bravely behaved while repelling the attack of Nazi planes on the convoy. The decision was unanimous to accept them as party candidates. The decision of the bureau was immediately broadcast to the entire crew. The transports we were guarding arrived safely at their destination. For Gremieshchi, the fight with enemy planes was not without consequences. Close bursts of bombs caused the ship some damage. Repairs were required. The factory was overloaded, so all the work had to be done by their own forces. Several brigades were organized from the personnel of the electromechanical part to help the upper crew. The machinists under the direction of Communist Sojin were tidying up the racks of depth bombs and doors in the superstructure rooms, which had been blown off by the blast wave. Chief Bosun Rechin, together with his subordinate sailors of the bosun's crew, repaired damages to rigging and dinghies. The most difficult task fell to the share of boiler machinists. Water tubes were leaking in the boilers. It was necessary to find the damaged tubes, plug or change them, check, clean, roll and roll the rest. In factory conditions, 6 to 7 days were allowed for this work. Boiler machinists, under the leadership of petty officers Bedreni and Korotkov, managed to complete the work in 3 days. They worked without rest, until the most picky inspection showed that the boilers were in exemplary condition. By the end of the 3rd day, Gremieszcz, shining with fresh colouring, was ready to sail again. The Arctic Circle came spring. The sun, which in winter did not even show from behind the horizon, began to linger longer and longer and longer in the sky. But storms and tempests were still frequent. Exhausted sailors returned from campaigns, and they had to sail a lot each time for several days, during which 5 or even 7,000 miles were added to the log counter. After one of such campaigns, Gremieszcz returned to Węgry and stood at the berth. Life flowed according to the normal daily routine. The enemy's airplanes now bothered us less. There was more aviation in the fleet. New types of high-speed Soviet airplanes appeared. The working day was coming to an end. There was an evening inspection at the Uta. Unit commanders announced the combat training plan for the next day. The crew was disbanded for rest. Many had already had time to lie down in their bunks. Day watchmen turned on the night lights. But no one was awake, waiting for the latest news. Newspapers at that time were not regularly delivered to the ships, so the radio was the main source of information for us. Sailors were impatiently waiting for news from the fronts. By this time, our army was continuously increasing the force of strikes against the enemy. Reproducers spread the familiar voice of Leviton. The sailors fell silent, and suddenly we heard something none of us expected. For bravery in battles with the German invaders, for fortitude and courage, for high military discipline and organization, for the unparalleled heroism of the personnel, to award the Guards rank to the squadron destroyer Gremieszcz of the Northern Fleet. There was no silence in the cabins. A squall of wind blew the sailors out of their bunks. With the new deputy on political part, Lieutenant Captain P. I, Belosov, we go around the premises, congratulate people on the joyful event. Our ship was the first of the destroyers of the Northern Fleet, was awarded the high rank of Guards. In the morning, sailors gathered at the yurt. The meeting opens P.I. Belosov. When I then read out the order on awarding the ship the Guard rank, the loud hurrah for a long time is not silent over the bay. Speaking at the rally, sailors, petty officers and officers thanked the party and the government for the high honour and trust, talked about the responsibility that the crew of the honorary title. At the party meeting held on the same day, the ship's Partorg Lebedev warned the communists that it was necessary to work even more with people. That day a few more of the best sailors were accepted into the party ranks. Our party organisation was constantly replenishing its ranks. Communists were the backbone that cemented and united the collective. To the credit of the party organisation of the ship, all its members were an example in battle and work. Lebedev played a great role in strengthening the party organisation. Before the Patriotic War, he was a Partorg of one of the large factories in Leningrad. A man of great experience, he quickly got used to his new job. Our Partorg knew people well. He deeply studied the complex ship's equipment. Most of the time he was at combat posts. In battle he was always in the place where it was the most difficult. Sailors respected him, listened to his every word. Soon came a solemn day for Gremeni. Sailors built a large assembly. New black and yellow Guards ribbons flutter in the light wind on sailors' visors. A member of the Fleet Military Council, Vice Admiral Aaa Nikolaevs, hands me attached to the shaft of the Guards' banner. This is our native Soviet Navy flag with a scarlet star and sickle and hammer. Only above the blue, like the sea, border at the bottom of the cloth now appeared black and yellow stripes of the Guards' ribbon. Raising the Guards' banner high, I slowly walk around the formation. The faces of the sailors shine with pride. And then the sailors kneel down and, following me, loudly repeat the words of the Guards' oath. We swear to the motherland to beat the enemy even harder, not to spare our lives for the sake of victory. With our lives we swear never to retreat before the enemy. We are ready to accept death, but not to tarnish the honor of the Guard's banner. For the happiness and freedom of our fathers and mothers, wives and children, we, the guardsmen of the destroyer Gremyshchi, will go forward, and only forward, until the complete destruction of the enemy. To the sound of the anthem, Guard's banner soars on the aft flagpole Gremyshchi. And a few hours later the destroyer was already at sea. In Arkhangelsk we received 4 transports bound for Murmansk. Gremyshchi was drawing a zigzag, covering the caravan from the sea. Approaching the Tursko-Orlovsky lighthouse, we received a message from the shore post an enemy submarine was detected not far to the northeast. We started to search for it. Soon acoustician Sergeyev found it. The first series of depth bombs flew into the sea. Again and again we bombed the suspicious area. I do not know how successful the attack was. We had no time to observe its results. Having caught up with the transport, the destroyer took its place in the convoy. To finish the boat came our boats from Punoy. The caravan arrived in Murmansk safe and sound. The ship was still most of the time at sea, escorting caravans of ships. The work was familiar and required only constant attention and high alertness. And sailing became more fun. In addition to guard ships, convoys now covered and aviation. This, of course, did not mean that we had a peaceful everyday life. We had to be always on the lookout. I remember once the convoy was suddenly attacked by enemy planes. Anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. The ship continuously maneuvered, dodging the blows and trying to protect the transports. Around the ship rattled explosions of bombs dropped by Nazi planes. In the heat of battle, we did not immediately notice that the impact of the blast wave broke the attachment of depth bombs, and they rolled on the deck. Here, at the stern, a smoke bomb pierced by a shrapnel caught fire. This threatened great trouble from the burning checker could catch fire and others, and next to the checkers were depth bombs. The explosion of one of them was enough to destroy the ship. The first to notice the trouble was Petty Officer of the 2nd Article Kirillov. Not paying attention to the whistling of shrapnel, he rushed to the burning checker. The thick smoke ate his eyes, took his breath away. The smoke-forming mixture from the punctured checker spread across the deck. Combining with the air, it became very hot. The petty officer's legs were burning, but he still reached the checker and threw it overboard. The comrades who had arrived secured the depth bombs. The danger was averted. The crew parted with many sailors as experienced specialists. They were taken to other ships to train young people. For some time there were not enough people at the battle stations. Discussing the situation, Komsomol members of the artillery combat unit made a proposal each sailor to learn a second specialty. This idea was submitted by a communist petty officer of the 1st Article Nikifor Phil. The initiative of the artilleryman was taken up by sailors of other units. Signalmen began to study radio engineering. Artillerymen mastered the specialty of mines, etc. They studied seriously and diligently. After a while, many sailors successfully replaced their comrades at adjacent combat posts. This patriotic initiative, started on the Guard's destroyer, later spread to all ships of the Northern Fleet. The officers of the ship worked in friendship. They tirelessly taught their subordinates, and in battle served as a model of courage and skill for them. The situation forced us to constantly search for new things, both in the ways of using weapons and equipment, and in the methods of training and education of people. It was not so easy. There were some outdated attitudes clinging tenaciously to the Navy. Worst of all, that these outmoded, not justified in the combat situation provisions were still preserved in the instructions and manuals. Very often what was written in the documents did not correspond to the requirements of reality. And yet the paper had the force of law, and to make changes in it was a matter of canny and difficult. Fortunately, we were actively supported by the commander of the division, Captain 2nd Rank A. I, Gurin, himself a great lover of novelty and experiments. By common efforts we managed to update a number of instructions. Almost all our officers were communists, people of high principle, fervent patriots. They knew how to inspire people with their personal heroism. Once, when we were standing in Murmansk, the ship was suddenly attacked by 16 enemy planes. We tried to throw them off the course with barrage war. Still some bombs fell near us. One of the bombs penetrated the pier and exploded under the hull of the ship. The explosion raised a gigantic column of water and mud. The ship was thrown up sharply. The moorings broke from the shock. Mud flooded the guns, covered the sights. Senior Lieutenant Moskowitz, who was directing the firing, took off his tunic and began to wipe the sights with its lining. All this was done while the bombs were tearing around the ship. Encouraged by the commander's bravery, the anti-aircraft gunners opened a hurricane fire. In the same battle I witnessed such a case. A young machine gunner, for the first time caught in such a fight, confused and fired into the sky without aiming. Noticing this, Senior Lieutenant Vasiliev grabbed the machine gun handles from the sailor's hands and started firing himself, forcing the sailor to feed the ammunition. It was really a study by ostentation. When I asked the sailor after the battle if he was scared, he said, "It was scary, but now I am ashamed. The senior lieutenant taught me a good lesson. Thank him. And you can trust me, I will no longer be confused in battle." I myself was now convinced that this sailor would never get cold feet again. In October, the Barents Sea is rarely calm. Northern and northeastern winds now, and then break out on the ocean expanses, raising a huge wave. The day becomes gloomy. The wave crests torn off by the wind freeze on the fly and cut the face with icy prickles. Blizzards often strike. Usually they come in strips, that's why they got the name of snowstorms. It is difficult for a navigator in such weather. Visibility is reduced to zero, and the polar night begins to take its rights. Days become short, dim and more like evening twilight. In such conditions in the fall of 1943, destroyers Gremieshi and Loud received the task to convoy the transport Marina Raskova to Novaya Zemlya. The transport is large, 12,000 tons of displacement, but it was valuable not only for its size. It carried cargoes to the Northern Island bases and polar winterers' food, ammunition, warm clothes, fuel, as well as tractors, airplanes and other equipment. In addition, the ship was carrying 150 passengers, new winterers, and their families. Navigation was closing. If Marina Raskova could not reach its destination, our polar explorers would be left without the most essentials for the winter. We caught up with the transport at the exit from the throat of the White Sea, as it had left Arkhangelsk before us. Having exchanged call signs with him, destroyers took their place in the convoy. Already at the exit from the White Sea, we received a radiogram. The posts of Novaya Zemlya reported the presence of floating mines in the area where our way lay. It was felt that the fleet command was very worried about the success of the passage. From our own experience, we knew that the west winds to Novaya Zemlya bring a lot of mines, blown off the anchors. English, French, Norwegian, Swedish mines could be found here. Therefore, this area has always been dangerous for sailing. Quite recently, when our ships were escorting icebreakers to the north, Soviet sailors shot 12 floating mines in the Kolgayev-Novaya Zemlya area. But then the sailing conditions were much easier, the weather was calmer and visibility was better. Having invited political officer Belousov and Partorg Lebedev to the bridge, I asked them to familiarize people with the situation, to call everyone to vigilance. The weather forecast given to us by meteorologists did not bode well. A powerful cyclone was coming. With the good wishes of the fleet commander, the ships went to sea. This time on the Gremieshi went his former commander, and now commander of the division and senior convoy captain, second rank Gurin. At first the wind was weak, but in 3 hours the weather forecast we received in the base began to justify itself. Black clouds hung low over the sea. A fog lay over the waves. It was pitch black. Even our most astute signallers Fokiv and Onokov could hardly distinguish a nearby transport. And the wind turned into a hurricane. The water was crashing on the bridge and bubbling at our feet. There was nothing to say about the upper deck, it was all hidden in the raging maelstrom. The roll reached 50 degrees. The ship was losing speed and ceased to obey the rudder. The hull of the destroyer was bending on the wave, the tops of the masts were converging and diverging, threatening to break the antennas. I remembered that it was in such a storm last year the destroyer crushing our partner in many operations died. Its hull could not withstand and on the wave broke in half. Will our Gremieshi survive? Several hours passed in the fight against the storm. Suddenly Onokov reported that the transport had changed course and was coming towards us. We hardly dodged the meeting, as from the other side there was a report from Fokiv that the ship had changed course again and was heading towards the Gremishchi. Gurin asked the captain of the transport what happened. The answer was alarming. The ship's steering failed. There is no way to fix it. The rudder is beaten off by the wave. The huge transport became a toy of waves and wind. It was impossible to speak on the bridge. In the noise of the hurricane, people could not hear each other. We had to shout directly into the ear. Continuous nervous tension exhausted people. The helmsman changed every hour. The watchstander was resting at the rudder control bollard. But as hard as it was on the top watch, it was even harder in the engine and boiler rooms. Here the heat was added to the rocking, as all the rooms were tightly closed, as they should be according to the combat schedule. The machinists had already been working several shifts without a shift, and there was no possibility to change them. It was impossible to walk along the upper deck in such a wave without risking to be washed overboard. The commander of the fleet was informed about the situation by a radiogram. It was the only radiogram for the whole campaign. We got the answer: continue the operation. There was nowhere to wait for help. We could count only on our own forces. Having consulted with the division commander, we decided Marina Raskova will be taken in tow by Gremyashchi. We will start it with the dawn. At night about such work was out of the question. The most difficult thing in such a situation is to give the towing cable to the transport. Giant waves violently toss both ship and vessel. When approaching, a collision is possible, which would not be good for us or the transport. For safety, we decided to resort to a method not provided for in the textbooks of maritime practice. The rattling will approach the stern of the transport with its bow and transfer the tugboat. After that, the Marina Raskova will give way. Our duty will be only to skid the stern of the transport from right to left to keep it on course. At the signal of the alert sailors, Gremyashchi went to the upper deck. On the half-tank, subordinates of Bosun Rechkin, bow gunners and other sailors were preparing a heavy steel cable. The waves were crashing on people, threatening to wash them away. But the sailors worked, supporting each other. Assistant Commander Veseliev and ship artilleryman Gavrilov led the work. It was not possible to approach the transport at once. The ship was rapidly thrown on the transport. They maneuvered for a long time before they managed to throw the throwing end. But now the tow rope was fastened. The transport started to move. We helped it to lie on the set course. And so we travelled about 40 miles. It was a tremendous effort. The transport did not want to obey us, and we could hardly manage on high, like mountains, waves. The ship was constantly off course. The dawn did not bring anything good. The hurricane raged on. Our progress was slowing down. We decided to take a risk and change the type of towing. Once again the sailors went to the upper deck. Now they are working on the Utes, on its aft part. Here it is even more difficult for them. The half bay, where yesterday sailors were tormented with cables, is high above the water. Not every wave reached here. It's a different matter at the Utes. Here the deck is low and the waves roll over it freely. People can get swept over their heads at times. Sailors have to tie themselves with ropes, not to inadvertently find themselves overboard. Vasiliev and Rechkin are leading the work. Here and the party leader of the ship, Lieutenant Commander Lebedev. He works on an equal footing with everyone. His participation alone inspires the sailors. The matter is moving slowly. The wave scatters, tangles cables. Choking, stiff from the cold in soaked clothes, sailors again and again untangle steel ropes, stack them on the deck. Cautiously approaching the stern to the bow of the transport. The slightest misstep, and we will be thrown on the ship, smash the ship's stern, break the propellers and rudder. We work our machines backwards and forwards. Thousands of stroke changes were required for the machinists to keep the ship at a given distance. I remember with gratitude senior machinists Marchenko and Rizhov, who stood at the maneuvering valves and instantly executed the commands coming from the bridge. While we were taking the transport in tow, Gromky was guarding us. The precaution was not unreasonable. Soon Loud detected an enemy submarine. The ship immediately rushed to her. The enemy's attack was thwarted. Loud went around us in an increasing spiral and threw depth bombs, driving the boat to depth. After several hours of work, 4 4-inch steel ends were fed to the transport and secured to the ship behind the 4th gun. The sailors breathed a sigh of relief. The joy was short-lived. No sooner had I given one machine the smallest forward stroke than the transport, flying to the top of the huge shaft, so tore us up that the steel ropes, one after another, burst like rotten shoelaces. We had to start all over again. There were no more suitable ropes on the burden. The captain of the transport was asked. He replied that there were cables on the ship, but they were in the hold. The captain was offered to mobilize for emergency work not only crew members, but all passengers regardless of gender. The semaphore negotiations dragged on. To act with flags in such a rocking, the signalman must have the art of a tightrope walker. While one of the signallers wrote with flags, the other supported him so that his comrade did not fall off the bridge. At last the transport reported that 2 ends were ready, a 6-inch steel end and a hemp end of the same thickness. We decided that it would be better to use both ropes at once. And again began the tedious and dangerous manoeuvring. Frankly speaking, at times my heart was cold. When we climbed the ridge, the nose of the transport was far below, and then it, tall, huge, flew above our deck and seemed about to collapse on us with all its weight. From the transport came the towing ends. They were long and sagged a lot. It softened the jerks. Towing began. With great difficulty we managed to turn the transport to the desired course. Going straight, he stubbornly did not want to trot to one side or the other, and pulled the stern of the destroyer, which compared to him seemed very small. Then someone suggested the idea, what if the Loud will connect the tugboat with the stern of the transport, and thus serve as his rudder? The suggestion was liked. Signal searchlight called Loud, which was still running around the caravan, dropping depth bombs. Approach Loud to the stern of the transport was already much easier, because the ship now had a forward motion, and it is less tossed on the wave. As a result of friendly efforts of the destroyer and transport teams, the stern tug was started. The speed of movement after that increased. We were no longer swept off course. Now worried about another thing, ships and transports, connected in one chain, lost freedom of maneuver. A perfect target for submarines, said Gurin, standing next to me. But there was nothing to do. It was the only way to tow the transport confidently on a huge wave. The machines of the Gremeni now had to provide the running of 3 ships. According to the revolutions of the propellers, we were supposed to move at a speed of 12 knots, but in fact we could barely squeeze out 2 or 3 knots. The men were exhausted. Despite the danger of attack by enemy boats, I was forced to let some of the sailors rest. The sailors went down to the cabins, changed into dry clothes, but no one dared to sleep downstairs. Having taken bunks, people laid down closer to their battle stations. Those who managed to grab a place by the chimney on the rostraks were considered lucky. It was drier and warmer there. For 2 days the crew had not received hot food. It was impossible to cook it in the terrible rocking conditions. And we on the bridge forgot the last time we had a real meal. When hunger became absolutely unbearable, we chewed dry, hard as a stone galettes. And our surprise was great when the messenger brought hot potatoes in a uniform. The boiler machinists had managed to boil them. We ate them without bread and salt, and I had never tasted a tastier meal. The unexpected lunch raised the mood. We heard jokes and laughter. It seemed that the storm became weaker and our speed increased. In fact, new trials were waiting for us. It was still a good 100 miles to the base, and we were running out of fuel. The oil pumps were more and more often taking air instead of fuel oil, and then the nozzles in the boilers went out. To avoid this, all the fuel was collected in 2 tanks, and the rest were filled with outside water, expecting to reduce the rocking of the ship. By some miracle, they managed to change the watch in the engine and boiler rooms, giving the exhausted machinists a chance to rest. But then came the message that from a strong concussion in one of the boilers leaked tubes. The ship's mechanic engineer, Captain Lieutenant Rotenfeld, accepted this news quite calmly. Having ordered in the other 2 boilers to keep steam on the mark and leaving the commander of the machine group, Soijin, at the post of power engineer, he went to the boiler room, where the accident occurred, 2 boilers quite provided the course of the ship, but who could guarantee that the disaster would not happen to the other boilers? So repairs were started immediately. Boiler machinists Shmarin, Komenko and Guskov volunteered to climb into the hot collector. They had to do such work before. The sailors quickly found the damage and repaired it. The boiler was put back into operation. On the 4th day, the caravan still advanced so far that the low shores of Novaya Zemlya became visible to the simple eye. The wind gradually subsided. The waves, too, became smaller under the protection of the shore, and no longer rolled over the ship. On the approach to Novaya Zemlya, we received a radiogram that on bearing 265 the coast posts had spotted a submarine. I looked at the map. The place of the boat's appearance was about 3 miles north of our path. So the enemy knew about the convoy and was waiting for it. We played the battle alarm and brought all weapons to action. Fokiv, the commander of the signalling squadron, who was watching on the port side, reported that he saw a floating mine. Bouncing, like the float of a fishing rod, it was sliding from wave to wave in 4 cables from the ship. It was bearing on the caravan. We couldn't turn away, nor could we increase our speed. Gurin ordered Laud immediately cut off the tugs. The destroyer, having fulfilled this order, immediately gave the reverse. And just in time. In the gate formed between the destroyer and the transport, the wave threw a mine, like a soccer ball in an empty gate. Giving us a little back, Laud, several lines of anti-aircraft guns destroyed the mine. We continued on our way. Laud no longer gave tow to the transport, but went around the caravan, periodically dropping depth bombs and firing diving shells from the guns. We also fired such shells to calm our souls, expecting that the rumble of explosions would get on the nerves of the fascist submariners. The boat did not show itself. Soon anti-submarine ships came out to search for her. Later we learned that they found and destroyed the submarine pirate. In the evening we pulled into the narrow gates of Beluga Bay. The journey is over. The command's task was accomplished. The ships stood in the roadstead, and it seemed that they were resting after hard work. The destroyers withstood such a load which perhaps even their creators did not think of. As we expected, the fuel in the tanks remained only about 40 tons. It's pointless to go to sea with such a reserve. The fleet headquarters received the second radiogram for the campaign, arrived Novaya Zemlya. We need fuel for return. Having learned about this radiogram, the captain of Marina Roskova was indignant. Why didn't they talk to me? We have a lot of fuel. We'll share it with you. And there was a feast on the ships. For the first time in 4 days was cooked hot food. The commanders ordered to give out vodka, which is required by the norms. Officers dined together with sailors. They recalled the difficulties of the campaign, admired the heroism of those who in the storm worked on the upper deck, winding the towing ends. In the morning the ships set out on the way back. We had to hurry. A new combat mission was waiting for us in the base. A day and a half later we arrived in Arkhangelsk. In Solombala, the first person we saw on the pier was the Fleet Commander Admiral A.G. Golovko. He congratulated us on our success and thanked us for the exemplary fulfillment of the most difficult task. And 2 days later on board the Guards destroyer Gremishchi were lined up sailors of both destroyers involved in the campaign. 142 people received government awards. Despite the fact that the ship almost continuously participated in combat operations, still sometimes fell days when sailors received rest. Usually it was during preventive maintenance. During the day sailors worked, putting in order the mechanisms and weapons, and in the long polar evenings in the cabins was noisy and fun. Gremishchi was famous not only for fighting. We also had the best amateur art group in the fleet. Its concerts were held both on the ship and at the neighbours on other ships, at factories. Dozens of diplomas, received by the participants of our amateur activity from the Military Council of the Fleet and the Political Department of the Brigade of Destroyers, decorated the walls of the Lenin cabin Gremichny. Here you could find diplomas dating back to the time when the ship sailed in the Baltic. These documents, sailors were proud of these documents, maybe a little less than the combat merits of the destroyer. Evenings of amateur art were a wonderful recreation. and at the same time a kind of school sometimes from the stage fell such poisonous ditties in the address of negligent sailors that acted stronger than any punishment. Those who got on the tooth to our artists for a long time remembered the public criticism and tried not to make the same mistakes from now on. The main inspirers of amateur performances were political officer Belousov and party leader Lebedev. They searched for talents, of which there were many on the ship, helped in the selection of repertoire, supported amateur enthusiasts in every possible way. The musical production song about Grémichy was a special success. We staged it in many clubs of the northern bases, and everywhere it was received with delight. On the background of a large panel depicting a fast-running destroyer, a choir, a dance group, singers and reciters performed. The composition told about the deeds of the guardsmen, about their selfless love for the motherland. The production began with a song about the ship, the text of which was written by the ship's navigator E. Ivashenko, and the music was written by the famous composer Evgeny Zharkovsky. The song was loved by everyone. It was sung both in formation and when they were just going to smoke a cigarette on the ute. "Come on, guys, let's sing our favourite," said usually Bosun Rechkin, sitting down among the sailors, and the ship's singer-sailor Chicherin immediately began. "Let the sea meet us with a storm. Grémichy will not slow down its course." The song was picked up, and it was carried over the bay and coastal hills. Our amateur team had more than 60 participants. There was a large choir, a mixed orchestra, a dance group. Our artists helped a lot writer N. Panov, the author of a number of works about the life of the fleet. He lived on the ship and in the evenings willingly engaged with the sailors. He wrote ditties for the ship's couplets, poems and humorous stories, which were very popular. Performed our amateur performances and before the sailors of foreign fleets. Its success was extraordinary. Each number, as a rule, had to be repeated twice. The friendly family of sailors of the Gremichy was passionate about sports. The stadium in Poliani is carved among the rocks above the bay. One side of it, which faces the sea, is blocked by a high net, so that the ball during the game could not fall into the sea. The stadium has no grandstand. Spectators sit directly on granite terraces carved into the rocky slopes. That day there was an unimaginable noise over the stadium. There was a soccer match between the team of the Guards destroyer Grémichy and the British. The first half ended with the victory of the guests. During the break we approached our goal, which was defended by the assistant commander of the ship, Senior Lieutenant Gavrilov, who replaced Vasiliev, who received a new appointment. The captain of the team, Sailor Lapshinov, a fine soccer player and a favourite of the crew, explained something to the players of the team, and they listened very attentively. The referee's whistle called the teams to the field to continue the game, and the fight resumed. The English are avid soccer players. Not by chance England is considered the birthplace of this sport. Our sailors were initially afraid to compete with foreigners, but then friendly matches between the teams of our and allied ships became a custom. Each such meeting aroused great interest. On the days of the game, free from watch sailors rushed to the stadium, taking with them everything that could whistle, rattle, bang horns, basins, buckets, whistles of various systems. At the sharpest moments of the game, all this was set in motion, and the noise was deafening. And so it was now, especially since the preponderance on the field was already tilting towards the Soviet Guards. The final whistle of the referee recorded the score 4-3 in favour of the Grémichy. On the ship we had 2 soccer teams. One, staffed with the best players, took part in the fleet championship. The second, less strong, was practically its double. The coach of both teams was Sailor Lapshinov. It should be said that soccer on Grémichy became the most popular sport. Games were played in any conditions and on any grounds, up to the fact that the gates were replaced by piles of clothes removed from themselves players. But in all cases the game was strictly according to the rules, which was vigilantly monitored by Lapshinov. Sailors were also fond of volleyball, boxing, rowing. Many times there were held competitions with allies in rowing and sailing. In free hours there was something to do for the sailors. The ship had a good library, which numbered several hundred books and was constantly replenished. Textbooks occupied a prominent place in it. The sailors were eager to learn. Officers willingly helped them in their studies. Many of the sailors who began their service with 5-6 grades of secondary school, at the end of the war managed to pass exams for the 8th and 9th grades. The guardsmen of the Gremini had many friends. Sailors of surface ships and transports, submariners, naval pilots acted shoulder to shoulder, a single combat family. We watched with admiration the feats of our pilots. Aviation increasingly successfully interacted with the ships of the fleet, covering them from the air, participating in the search and destruction of enemy submarines. Especially great help was rendered to us by aviation during daytime, and in the north from Mal to September there is a continuous polar day, and airplanes can operate around the clock. Airplanes flew out long before the convoy left the base and surveyed the sea from the air along the upcoming course of the ships, and then accompanied us to the sea. Usually flying boats were used for this purpose. Having a long range, they could accompany us on the whole passage. We were escorting a convoy heading for Matochkin Shah when the airplane escorting us near Kolgoyev Island detected a submarine. Returning to the convoy, the pilot signaled for the ships to follow him. He began to make circles over the boat. There was nothing left for us but to bomb this area thoroughly, discouraging the fascist submariners from thinking about attacking the convoy. If flying boats protected us from underwater predators, then the fighter aviation protected us from the air. Without aviation support, surface ships of the fleet would hardly be able to fulfill the tasks assigned to them. In August 1943, from Arkhangelsk followed a convoy of 6 transports in the guard of 3 destroyers. On the approach to Kildin Island, the ships were attacked by enemy planes. There was a fight. To help us urgently flew aviation. Fighter pilots Kurtsankov, Skibnev, Panin, Verbitsky were over the place of battle in a few minutes. Rushing to the enemy planes, they shot down 2 of them and drove away the rest. Having accomplished the task, the Red Star fighters, waving us goodbye, returned to the airfield. The pilots were often on our ships, and when they had a chance they went to sea with us. Sometimes, having returned from a big flight, pilots Sorokin, Panin, Kovalenko hurried to their friends on Gremyashi to share their impressions and joys, and things were getting better and better for them. The aviation of the Northern Fleet made massive raids on the enemy airfields, bombed his rear. There was a strong front friendship between us and the pilots. We jointly accomplished the deed that was bloodily necessary for our motherland. The pier of the submarine was located in Polyarny, in the very corner of the Ekaterinskaya harbour. We loved to visit here, to listen to the exciting stories of submariners about their distant raids into enemy waters. We will never forget how we, destroyer officers, stood on the pier together with our submarine friends and looked out into the bay. We were waiting for the boat commanded by hero of the Soviet Union, Kabo. There its narrow, long hull appeared from behind a rocky cape, and immediately gun shots rang out. The submariners were informing their friends about 2 battle victories. When the boat moored at the dock, everyone rushed to embrace the heroes. We knew many of the submariners well. Together with them rested together and went to sea. The destroyers often escorted the boats on distant trips to the coasts occupied by the enemy, guarding their fighting friends from enemy planes and gunboats. In turn, the submariners more than once helped us out, attacking Nazi ships and providing valuable information about the enemy. Breaking out of our embrace, Kabo hurried to tell us that in the area of the port of Vard accumulated a lot of enemy ships. This was a very important message. The next day the destroyers headed for Vard. Together with the destroyers in the operation took part and the boats that were in position. The boat of hero of the Soviet Union, Lunin, entered the harbour of one of the fjords and sank the transport that was there, and then surfaced and from the guns destroyed several boats, taking prisoners. The actions of the submariners diverted the attention of the enemy. Taking advantage of this, the destroyers launched a torpedo strike, as a result of which the enemy lost 2 more transports. It was a real combat partnership. Submariners were frequent and welcome guests on our ships. We organised joint recreation evenings. Everywhere the guardsmen of the Gremini had friends. We felt their elbow all the time. And what inspired us most of all, gave birth to indomitable energy, was the consciousness that all our great nation was with us. It follows the successes of its soldiers, is proud of their military deeds. workers of the rear supplied us with everything we needed. Continuously improved combat equipment, which came to the ships. On Gremieshi appeared automatic guns, new bombometers with a long-range hydro and radar. In one of the November days of 1943, just before the holiday of the Great October Revolution, the workers of Novosibirsk sent us their labor gifts. In one of the boxes was the newest lag, a device for measuring the distance traveled by the ship. In other boxes, compasses, navigational accessories. And on each gift there was a nickel-plated plate with the inscription to Gremreneni from the workers of Novosibirsk. In their letter, the Novosibirsk workers instructed the sailors to beat the enemy even harder in order to expel the foreign invaders from our land sooner. There is nothing to say how happy and excited we were with these gifts from a distant city. We assured the people of Novosibirsk that we would honorably fulfill their order. For almost 2 years I had a chance to command the Gremieshi. I travelled tens of thousands of miles with its sailors. These were difficult, tense and dangerous campaigns. But I can safely say that I have never felt such satisfaction with my service. Wonderful people were on that ship. Dignifiedly, proudly they carried the guard rank, and by their military deeds did a lot for the approaching victory over the enemy.